This will continue our lecture series for Introductory Psychology, or Psych 1. So today we're going to talk about how social behavior is affected by situational forces. We often think that the reason people act in the ways that they do is because of their personality or something about who they are, what kind of person they are. But actually, psychological research has provided us many examples of where people's behavior is strongly influenced by the situations they find themselves in. Sometimes couples get divorced not because either one of them is a bad person, but because the situation has put additional stress onto their relationship and their relationship falls apart over time. Or that you may engage in a bad behavior, right? You may do something that you don't think of yourself as being capable of because the situation has sort of encouraged you to act that way. And oftentimes we don't even realize that that's happening. So today we're going to talk about examples of how situational forces really alter your behavior. Let's go ahead and get started. So there are 4 learning outcomes I have for this lecture today. First, we're going to discuss the causes of group behavior. Second, we're going to talk about 2 famous examples that have demonstrated how situational forces change people's behavior. Then we're going to talk about the 3 factors that lead to attraction. And lastly, we're going to talk about what research tells us helps to make marriages successful or can lead to divorce. So, social psychology, the field that studies social behavior within psychology, has long known about the role of compliance. Compliance is any change in behavior due to a request. Hey, could you help me out, please? Hey, I really need some assistance here. Excuse me, do you have time? All of those are examples of compliance if you then respond to that request. Now, you already inherently understand something about compliance because you've interacted with people and asked them to do favors for you. What's fascinating is that there are certain things that make compliance more likely to happen. One is something known as the foot in the door effect. This is when you ask for a small favor and then followed by a larger request, which is the request you actually want to have fulfilled. I'll give you an example. I used to ask groups of students in a 300-person lecture hall. I would pick 6 students and I would ask them to walk around the room. 6 students. Because it's a big lecture hall and I would do it at the beginning of class, most people usually went along with it, right? That's just get up out of your seat, walk around the room real fast, go back and sit down, okay? Then the second step is I would take those original 6 students and I would then ask them to come and stand behind me while I lectured. This group of students often complied, but then I had a second group of 6 students that I walked up to them and said, will you please come and stand behind me while I lecture? These groups of students were not asked the small favor first, and they're more likely to resist. Only about 3 or 4 of them might actually come up and stand behind me while I lectured. There are many examples of foot in the door. Try it out on your friends, try it out on your parents. First ask for a kitty, then ask for a pony. Another example of compliance is something called the lowball technique. In the lowball technique, you underestimate the amount of effort that's actually required for a task. Hey, do you want to come help me move? It's only going to take an hour or 2. I've already got everything boxed up. And then you get over there and they haven't started anything. And actually, it's going to take 3 or 4 hours at minimum just to get them started. Hey, I'll reward you with pizza. And then you're like, no, now you need to pay me. That would be an example of the lowball technique. But actually, we don't always do things or change our behavior just because people ask us to. Sometimes we actually change our behavior in small ways because we're responding to this invisible social pressure. We call this conformity. Conformity is when you change your attitude or your behavior to try to fit into the norms of a group. It happens all the time, right? You wear certain clothes because people tell you, well, this is what people of your gender are supposed to wear, right? There are multiple examples of young boys and young men trying to wear dresses to high school proms and not being allowed. There used to be many examples of women trying to wear tuxedos to those proms and not being allowed in. So that's just one example of literally thousands of examples of conformity. Now, sometimes sort of we talk about the ways in which conformity helps society function, right? How people get in line, nobody really cuts, right? In some ways, conformity helps society to work. But it also, as with the example of gendered clothing, it also can be disruptive when somebody tries to go against what other people think is the norms of the group. Now, there are actually two different examples of conformity. There is informational conformity. That's how you use it to gain accurate information. If you don't know what the right answer is, you may rely on other people around you. For example, if an instructor asks for an answer on a sample test, right? And one of your friends is really sure, they're like, this is D. I know the answer is D. It's this one right here. And they're really positive, right? You may let them give the answer, but internally you may be thinking to yourself, I don't think that's the right answer, but I don't really know statistics that much, and so I'm really struggling with this material, and so you'll let them give the answer. But then when your instructor tells them they're wrong, you are like, oh, I knew it, right? In hindsight, you knew you had the right answer, when in fact, actually, you didn't, or at least you weren't willing to speak up about it. So that would be informational conformity. Another example of conformity is normative conformity. This is when you accept someone else's behavior and you go along with it just because you want to be accepted by a group. If one of your friends is bullying a kid when you were younger and you didn't do anything to stop it, that would be normative conformity. If the people at your work start complaining about headaches because they think there's a gas leak, right? And you want to be accepted by them and you're like, well, I guess there might be a gas leak. So there are two different kinds of conformity. There's informational conformity, when you try to gain accurate information. You don't think you know the right answer, but someone in your group does, so you may rely on them. If your instructor is asking for answers on a sample test, and a friend of yours is positive they have the right answer, and they're really determined to give their answer, but internally you're thinking to yourself, that's not the right answer, I don't think so, but you don't really know for sure, right? It's a class you're maybe struggling a little bit, or it's a concept you're struggling a bit with. So internally you aren't really sure, so you don't speak up. When your friend gets the wrong answer, you may tell them or think to yourself, I knew it. I knew that wasn't the right answer. That would be informational conformity. Another example would be if your coworkers start complaining about the smell of gas and they start getting headaches, you go along with it and eventually you convince yourself that you also have a headache. Right? That would be an example of informational conformity. You think your coworkers have more information about the presence of gas or a gas leak than you do. Another kind of conformity is normative conformity. This is when you just want to be accepted by the group. Maybe as a kid you went along with an episode of bullying, or you didn't intervene because it was your friend who was doing the bullying. That would be an example of normative conformity, as well as the clothing that we wear. Right? Your 5-year-old son decides he wants to be a princess for Halloween and you tell him no, right? Because both you as a parent want to be accepted and you want your child to be accepted by the group. Those are normative conformity examples. Now, conformity was first studied in the 1950s by a man known as Solomon Asch. Solomon Asch, pictured here, was responding to the after effects of Nazi Germany, where there were multiple examples of Nazi soldiers committing atrocious acts, even though they were testified by friends and family that these were good people, they were upstanding citizens, they could never do some of these acts, but yet there was clearly eyewitness testimony showing that they had conducted some of these atrocious acts. So Solomon Asch believed, in fact, that maybe part of the reason that some of these soldiers, who were otherwise good people, did these things is because they were sort of going along or conforming with the group, right? They were doing what everyone around them was doing as part of the military, or many individuals were doing as part of the military. To research this, Solomon Asch developed an ingenious experiment that he said was about visual perception. Okay? What he did was he asked participants to compare a single line written on a card to a set of 3 lines and to match it up. Which line Which of these three matches with this line here? So then he would run you through a few trials comparing it. It's a pretty easy task. Most people get it right when they're by themselves. But then he would bring you in with a group of 4 other confederates, people who were actually in on the experiment. And these 4 confederates would give purposely wrong answers. Now, you're the last person in line. The 4 people before you all gave the wrong answer. What do? Well, Solomon Asch found that people tended to conform at least some of the time. That in his study, 35% of his participants repeatedly gave the incorrect answer. Even though they would tell themselves, I know that's not right, they would say things to themselves like, I don't want to embarrass that person by telling them they're wrong. So they would go along with the group and they would give the wrong answer. And in fact, 75% of his participants conformed at least once. So 3 out of every 4 of his participants at least went along with the group once. We know that conformity is powerful, even in cultures like the United States where people feel like they're independent and they do their own thing. We really don't, right? We go along with the group. Now, Solomon Asch's work and work by others has shown us that in fact you can increase conformity by increasing the difficulty of the task. If you make the difference between the lines smaller, so they look like they're more similar, people are more likely to conform. We also know that if any one of those 4 confederates dissents, if they all go their own way and somebody says, no, I'm going to give a different answer. It doesn't even have to be the right answer. It just has to be a different answer. That also abolishes conformity. And we'll see that those single dissenters are important in other kinds of social obedience. Lastly, we also know that there are some cultural differences in results. So a collectivistic culture are cultures that focus on blending in and getting along. East Asian cultures, cultures in Israel, as well as in some other countries, show this sense of getting along, sacrificing for your family, right? Doing what's right by the group of people you're with. Not surprisingly, collectivistic cultures show slightly higher rates of conformity. In the Solomon Asch version of the experiment we just talked about, 91% of participants in Japan go along at least once, right? So a little bit higher than in the United States. Now, countries like the United States, Western Europe, Australia, New Zealand, those are called individualistic cultures. In an individualistic culture, you focus on individual success, getting ahead, right? That very much kind of describes a lot of how American cultural experiences tend to happen. But again, even in that individualistic culture, remember, 75% of people are conforming at least once. Now, conformity can't possibly explain all of the atrocities that happened in Nazi Germany during World War II. It wasn't just that soldiers were going along with the group, blindly following an unspoken order. In fact, actually, they were receiving direct orders, right? Obedience is compliance with any order to perform some task. And we recognize that there are many social groups that use obedience. And in fact, we wouldn't be able to function if not for obedience. Can you imagine what a traditional classroom would be like if students didn't obey, if they didn't sit quietly, if they didn't wait for the teacher to ask questions or to start lecturing or to give out assignments, if everyone was just doing their own thing? Obedience is at some level necessary for society to function, but it also has a dark side. So Stanley Milgram was a student of Solomon Asch, and Stanley Milgram believed that in fact obedience was more important in determining some of the actions that happened in World War II. So Stanley Milgram designed one of the most famous or infamous studies, partially famous because of it breached some ethical barriers in psychology, but also because of what it showed us about human behavior. In this experiment, participants, they were 40 middle-aged Caucasian men who were living in the New Haven area in Connecticut. These individuals were paid a small amount of money to participate in the study. They believed it was a study about learning and memory, that they were either going to be giving or receiving shock in a study because they were told that psychological research has shown that shock actually improves memory, right, when you get punishment for making mistakes. So, in fact, the experiment was rigged. The participants would always be the teachers. They were always going to be the people giving shock to another participant, but in fact that participant receiving the shock was in on the experiment. They were a Confederate. So you can see here in the picture, the guy with the glasses and the tie here, he is the Confederate. So he's being strapped in to a electric generator, okay, in a silent room, in a small room that he'll be in by himself. So the teacher, the actual participant, sees this person get strapped into the chair where they're going to receive shock every time they make a mistake on these word pair associations. The experimenters here and here are strapping down the electrodes. Then the door is closed, everyone leaves that room except for the person who's going to be receiving shock. The teacher is actually going to use the shock board, and it goes up in 15-volt increments from 15 volts to 450 volts every time the person who's receiving the shock, the student, is going to make a mistake. And in fact, as I told you, this is all a setup. The student here who's strapped into the chair actually pulls himself out of the electrodes right after the door closed, and they give purposely wrong answers because this experiment is really trying to see if someone in a lab coat stands behind you and tells you that the experiment must continue, would you actually continue to shock someone even when you hear them scream or yell or bang on the wall and say, I can't do this? Would you continue to shock them even after they've stopped responding, making it seem like they've fallen unconscious or maybe even died? So Stanley Milgram asked a group of senior students to predict how likely people would go all the way to the top of the shockboard, to 450 volts. These senior college students predicted that only 2%, only a few sociopaths, would actually go all the way. But the results of this study are very different. In fact, Milgram found that 65% of his participants would give potentially lethal shock. And now they didn't like it, right? They were stressed, they were miserable, they wanted to leave, they tried to leave multiple times. Some participants did stop somewhere between 130 and 165 volts. But most participants actually go all the way to the top. And once they go past about 150 or 180 volts, they basically keep going almost all the way to the top. So it's interesting in this experiment that people who are adults in reasonable positions of power, basically because they're listening to someone in a lab coat at a university, they do something that probably would normally go against their character. This again highlights that sometimes good people do bad things, not because of their personality, but because of the situation they find themselves in. Think about how this was structured. You have somebody in a lab coat from Yale making it seem like this is a scientific study that's worth something. And so these individuals, these guys, go along with it because they give that person they give over control. And often what they would say while giving shock is they would say, look, this isn't my fault. Like, this is on you, right? It's on the university. You guys are the scientists. You know what's happening. So they basically turn over control of this act to someone else. In addition, Stanley Milgram made this easier because he set this up as sort of a foot in the door technique. You start at 15 volts. Participants even actually got to feel what 15 volts was like. And 15 volts is not a lot. So it doesn't feel bad. And once you get them on that initial 15 volt kick, it's easy to get them to keep going because then it's just another 15, another 15. Oh, it's only 45 volts. That's not bad. Oh, it's just another one. Until eventually, right, they basically end up at 450 volts or 330 volts, doing something that probably you wouldn't ever convince them to start there. You couldn't say, hey, will you give this person 450 volts? But you can convince them if you structure the environment in such a way. One of the things that we've learned because of follow-ups of the Stanley Milgram studies is that you actually can reduce obedience when you get contact with the person. So while you're waiting outside for your turn to go into this project, into this study, if you talk to the person who you're supposed to shock, if you hear about their family, you develop some empathy for them, you'll see that only about 33% of people go to the top of the shock board. Think about that as only a third of you would shock your friend to death because they're your friend. Okay, the other thing is if it's a person with less authority, if you switch out the adult in the lab coat with an 18-year-old in a lab coat, the phone rings, they come in, they get the researcher, and instead it's now an undergraduate or college student who's standing there in the lab coat, then only about 20% of people go to the top of the shock board, okay? But More important, the most powerful thing Stanley Milgram found was that if you have rebellion, if while you're waiting your turn, if two people storm out, we're not doing this, this is immoral, this is unethical, this is wrong, somebody's going to die here. If you hear that, then only about 2% of people go all the way to the top of the chalkboard. So rebellion, in the Milgram studies, was as powerful as some disobedience in the Solomon Asch line experiments, right? If one person goes their own way and does something different, it seems to break both conformity and obedience. Okay, so we've been talking about how psychological studies show us the ways in which people's behavior is strongly influenced by situations, whether it's compliance or conformity and obedience. But now let's actually look at some applications of those ideas and how that actually might look in your everyday life. Let's start by talking about the factors that actually shape liking and loving. So this is not just for romantic love, but this is also for friendships. We know that you tend to be attracted to people who are similar to you. So we like those who are both physically and psychologically similar, whether it's in their belief systems, their personality traits, their socioeconomic background, and their appearance. The more they look like you and act like you, the more likely you are to develop a relationship or a friendship with them. And that makes sense, right? The people you grew up with around you tend to be from similar backgrounds to you. So it makes sense that you would like them. This goes against the failed common idea that opposites attract. I know we often want to believe that opposites attract, and I'm sure some of you are sitting there going, no, my boyfriend and I bet your boyfriend and you or your girlfriend and you are actually more similar than you believe. It is easy for us to see the differences between us and other people. Sometimes we don't notice some of the similarities. The other thing that helps to shape liking and loving is proximity. Sometimes if you just see someone day after day, your neighbor, your best friend, you're more likely to like them because you get to be exposed to them. You know that because people who are in these online dating relationships can form very powerful, deep attraction to one another in a very short period of time. It does not have to be physical proximity. Interestingly enough, multiple studies have shown that we often tend to fall in love with neighbors. So if you look at in new apartment buildings, if you look at people who, when they move in, they start out as single, and you see who actually tends to get into a relationship soonest, what you find is that in those apartment buildings, without elevators, it's people who live near stairwells, right? Because they often get to see people more frequently. So you want to be on one of the lower floors where you get lots of traffic, or you want to be near the front door, right? Okay, but similarity and proximity are not the only things that shape liking and loving. We are somewhat superficial, and that physical attraction does matter, right? We tend to like faces that are symmetrical, right? That they're similar in the right and left halves. You may have seen the TLC show about physical attractiveness and how symmetry really matters. But in addition, we also tend to like people who have large smiles, high cheekbones, and small noses. Interestingly enough, I tend to think of this as all the things that we use makeup or plastic surgery to change about ourselves, right? We whiten our teeth, we get our lips injected, we wear lipstick, we get cheek implants, people have their nose altered. They all tend to match in ways that agree across cultures what we find physically attractive. And this data about symmetry and smiles and cheekbones and noses applies across more than 13 different cultures we've looked at. But when you look at things other than facial attractiveness, so while facial attractiveness tends to be pretty consistent across many cultures, how people rate physical attractiveness and their body shape tends to differ. People are less consistent across cultures about their preferences for body shape. So cultures that have high food availability, like here in the US, we tend to prefer smaller body mass. People tend to rate smaller bodies as being more attractive. And cultures that have low food availability suggest that they prefer larger body mass. So these are the things that get you into a relationship or get you interested in someone, but what are the things that actually keep you together long term? Now, we often think that it's fighting or arguing, infidelity that predicts divorce. That's not necessarily true. And in fact, 30 years of data now shows us, in fact, that we can predict divorce with pretty high accuracy. So John Gottman is a retired professor from the University of Washington at Seattle. He's a clinical psychologist, does a lot of work in relationships and marriage counseling. John Gottman developed techniques for accurately predicting divorce in newlywed couples. So within 15 or 20 minutes of meeting a couple, he can predict with high accuracy whether or not they're going to get divorced in the next 10 or so years. So he observes their facial expressions, how they communicate, their physiology, heart rate, blood pressure, cortisol or stress hormone levels. For about 20 or 30 minutes, they basically come into a lab that looks like a bed and breakfast, essentially. They get hooked up to video cameras and everything gets recorded. They get all their blood samples taken, heart rate measured, skin sweating or skin galvanic response. And then he follows them for the next 10 years. And when he first started this study, he didn't know what was going to predict divorce, right? But by watching these couples over 10 years and following up and saying, how are you guys doing? What's going on in your relationship? Gottman was able to identify which couples are going to stay together and which ones get divorced, and then what things they were doing in year one that might help predict some of that. Again, it was not money, it was not infidelity, it was not fighting. He found, in fact, that dissolution or divorce in a relationship was really predicted by how couples respond to those challenges that every relationship has. John Gottman called these predictors of divorce the four horsemen of the apocalypse because these were the four major factors in newlyweds in year one that predicted that they were likely to get divorced. Think about the people you know who are in relationships. Do they do some of these things? First, he found that couples who are criticizing one another, you're worthless, you're lazy, you don't work very hard, you're so unmotivated about your life. It's not that they're criticizing the behaviors of the person they're in love with, they're actually criticizing the person themselves. You can imagine how, if you're constantly being criticized over 7 to 10 years in a relationship, how damaging that may be. The other thing that happens for couples who have been criticizing one another, they eventually stop communicating very well, and they become contemptuous of one another. Oh, here he goes again. He's always complaining at me. God, leave me alone sometimes. They roll their eyes. They make mocking sounds with their friends. Oh, God, she's my ball and chain, right? And they don't mean it in sort of a friendly, nice way. They mean it in a hurtful way. Basically, when you show contempt for your partner, you're no longer listening to them. Because really, if they're criticizing you, even though they're not doing it in the best way, there's probably something going on that they're frustrated with or they're upset about. And I agree, they don't know how to communicate it very well. But if you start mocking them or rolling your eyes at them, they're only going to get more and more frustrated. And then they're going to get defensive. It's not my fault, right? Well, look at all these things that you do, right? If you get defensive, right, if you feel attacked, and I realize it's hard to stop that response, but if you're being criticized, you need to sort of be somewhat cautious about how you respond. Don't let your emotions take control of that situation. Try to tell them, hey, I understand that you're upset with me, but you're not communicating it very well. And then the other thing is that when these couples have been criticized and they're contemptuous of one another and they're defensive and they're always bickering with one another, eventually those fights blow up. So then, right, they're yelling and screaming at one another and then one of them storms out. We call that stonewalling. I'm going to go stay with friends. I'll see you later. Right? I don't want to deal with this right now. So if you're not going to deal with it, so here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave. You're going to complain to your friends about all the things that are happening in your relationship that are bad. And then you're going to sleep it off. And the next day you're going to go home. And now it's been a day or two, and you don't really want to talk about it because it's uncomfortable. So you're not. You're just going to let it go. Except for, you're not really going to let it go. Because the thing that precipitated this whole fight, this thing, whatever it is, that one of you is worried about money, or that one of you is worried about you don't have a good sex life, or that one of you is worried about something that's happening with the kids, that never gets fixed because nobody wants to talk about it after you've walked out on a fight. If you got married and you want to stay married, then you need to sit down in that chair and you need to work it out. Like, I get that you may be explosively angry. So that means you need a timeout. You need a 20 minutes in a corner. You know what? We're not be having a productive discussion right now. I'm going to go put myself over here. I need to calm down. Give me 20 or 30 minutes. But then I want to come back and I want us to talk about it. That's how you actually have an effective fight or an effective discussion about improving your relationship. You don't walk out. You don't criticize. You don't get defensive every time your partner comes and suggests something to you. But let's say these things are happening, and let's say it's been 5 or 6 years, or 10 years, or 15 years. John Gottman has shown that, in fact, you can, with counseling and with a psychologist, you actually can reverse some of these things. So just because you do them now doesn't mean you're going to do them forever. But it takes work. For couples who have been doing these things for a long time, and they're at the breaking point, or nearly at the breaking point, he said there are 3 straws that you often start to see in that relationship. These are the 3 things that are shown by couples that are about to divorce. 1, they flood each other. So what's happening is they've had so many fights and there's all this built up resentment and anger. So 6 months ago, you did something and your wife or your husband or your boyfriend or your girlfriend, they were pissed. But they didn't want to fight, so they didn't say anything about it. But it's still in there and they've been sitting on it. And then one day, something happens, the straw that breaks the camel's back, and they just explode. So when they explode all over you, you get really defensive. It often leads to a highly aggressive argument. There's fighting, there's yelling. You may even hurt one another, not just emotionally, but also physically. These are intense reactions that happen. This flooding behavior where someone's been sitting on something for months and months or years and years, these are very damaging to a relationship. The other thing is that normally when couples fight, they have what we call repair attempts, right? Hey, I'm sorry, I didn't mean it, like I responded really badly, I fucked up here, whatever it might be. But eventually, if you've had all these fights and this thing keeps happening and you keep apologizing for it, those apologies and those flowers and hand holding and all those other things you normally do, they don't work anymore. They work in the beginning, right? Because your significant other says, I understand, like we both made a mistake here. Let's try to fix this. In this case, the couples refuse to make up anymore. They basically just build up more resentment. And then they start rewriting all their memories of their relationship. Happy memories suddenly become negative, hurt-filled, angry memories. Something that maybe at your wedding there was a hurricane, or on your honeymoon there was a hurricane. And at the time it was kind of funny and you guys kind of laughed about it and you sort of made the best of it, now becomes a sign that you should have never gotten married. Think about if you know someone who seems to have those bad memories. They're rewriting all the things about their relationship into these terrible moments. That can be reversed, but it takes time and effort. So, we know in fact that couples who are happy in their marriages have these things in common. So, they have the support of their family. Their family wants them to be married. They're happy for them being married. They have what we call homogamy. The couple tends to be similar to one another on major demographic variables. Somewhat similar in age, similar in IQ, similar in religious groups. Now, this isn't always true, but again, these tend to be true in happy marriages. The couple got married after the age of 25. Waiting to get married is probably one of the major predictors of long, happy marriages. Both people have clear goals about family and career, and those goals tend to match up in some way, right? They tend to help one another. They don't have to be the same goals, right? But the couple's able to talk about what those goals are and come to some clear consensus. They have a lot of togetherness. They see one another as their best friend. They've grown more interested in one another over time. So when you look at couples who are in their 50s and 60s, if they've had children and their children have moved away, suddenly this couple has become interested in one another all over again. It's often this second honeymoon for couples when their children move out because they rediscover one another. My parents have been together for 40 years now, and they really have rebonded once my brother and I moved out of the house. And it's like watching someone grow in love all over again. The other thing is that you really have to be able to express to your partner both the happy emotions that you have and also the not so happy emotions, the hurt, the sadness, the frustration, and about things with your partner as well as things outside of your relationship. You can't hold those negative things in. You need to be able to communicate them appropriately. You don't need to yell and scream, but you do have to be able to talk about them. Lastly, both people have to view that marriage as a long-term commitment, and even couples in their 80s continue to have sex, and they describe their sex life as satisfying. I know, you probably don't think about it. They don't have sex as frequently as they did maybe in their 20s or 30s, but people continue to have satisfying sex lives throughout their life. The other thing that John Gottman has shown us is not just the things that predict happy marriages in heterosexual couples, which often are the ones, right? Straight couples are the ones we often think about when we think about relationship success. But in fact, actually, we can look at what things predict success in gay and lesbian couples. What's fascinating is that, in fact, not surprisingly, right, gay and lesbian couples describe successful relationships in very similar ways to straight couples. Now, gay marriage hasn't been legal in the United States for very long, so we don't really have a lot of long-term data on marriage success, but we can look at couples that have been together for 15 or more years. One of the things we see is that gay couples who have been together for 15 or more years tend to be more positive about the success of their relationship, right? They say, we're going to do this, we're going to stay together. They tend to be less controlling of one another. They don't have clear gender roles about how each other is supposed to behave. You're supposed to do the cooking. You're supposed to be the one who's out working. They don't tend to have very many of those strict gender roles. They also tend to take fights less personally. They tend to have less explosive fights and they're less hostile to one another. Now, this is not to say that couples, gay and lesbian couples who are together for less than 15 years don't do some of these negative things. They do all the same things that we were just talking about that John Gottman says predicts relationship failure. But if you're a gay or lesbian couple and you've made it to year 15, that suggests that you're able to manage all those negative behaviors and maybe you're less likely to do them. We often get lots of discussion in the news media about the effects of gay and lesbian couples having children. Is it bad for those children? There was a sociological study from the University of Texas at Austin, pretty controversial. It's since been discredited. It tended to show negative side effects, negative effects on children who had gay or lesbian parents. Follow-up studies, or multiple follow-up studies, have really discredited that original study, and in fact we don't see any long-term negative effects on those children, except for that children of gay and lesbian couples, of course, have to deal with the stigma from other people, right? But that's not because they have gay or lesbian parents. That's because other people don't know how to understand or be sensitive to what it's like for someone who has gay or lesbian parents. Parents, gay and lesbian parents who have children, do the best to protect their children if they talk about some of the things that may happen. Hey, you may hear your friends call mom or dad this. You may hear some of these negative terms. And then how to confront those and how do you sort of deal with some of those. I have 2 kids and I happen to be gay. It is one of those things you need to talk about with your kids because otherwise they're not going to be prepared when it does happen, when school friends or strangers even say things that they don't know how to process. That ends our lecture for today. If you have any questions, please give me an email.